You'll recall earlier this year that the government released a discussion paper on mining, and it caused a lot of reaction, big march up Queen Street for example, and that really triggered the preparation of this report. And I really need to explain what the government's discussion paper was about a little bit, and then why I'm following it on with this report. So if we imagine that this is the land that is managed by DOC, the Department of Conservation, what we call the conservation estate in the report, then 40% of it, so if we come down from here, most of it is listed on what we call Schedule 4 of the Crown Minerals Act. All the national parks are in there, but there's a little bit of land that's not national parks as well. So all of this is on Schedule 4, and so is this. Those are the national parks, those are the ones that aren't, but all of that is on Schedule 4. The rest of it, the remaining 60%, is not on Schedule 4. That's very important to understand. Now, what the government's basic proposal was taking some bits of land out of Schedule 4 and putting them in here. And the reason for that is that when they're on Schedule 4, they're essentially off limits to any serious mining operations. And that was what the fuss was about. So the government has actually decided, which is good, to leave these areas of land in Schedule 4 and leave that untouched. But of course, this rest of the conservation estate is still mining can be done on them, mining can take place on it. And so this report is thinking about mining on this 60% of the conservation estate, which of course overall is not as precious to us as the national parks and these other special areas, but nonetheless is part of the conservation estate. If we're talking about mining on this 60% of the conservation estate off Schedule 4, how does this work? And there's really three parts to this. So if I erase this, there's three parts to getting a mine going on conservation estate if a company wants to do it. And I'm going to do 3 boxes on the board and talk about those. Okay, and in the first one I'm going to write permit. The second one I'm going to write access, and the third one are consents. Now, the permit is the first bit that kickstarts the process. That is a permit for the minerals that are under the ground, and that comes from the Minister of Energy and Resources. Then if he grants that, then the next 2 parts can happen. This one is access onto the conservation land, onto the land above the minerals. It actually applies generally to any landowner, but in this case of course the landowner is the Crown. Access onto the land to get the minerals. So permit to get the minerals, access onto the land in order to dig for the minerals, and then finally the standard RMA process with consents, and these will be granted by regional council and local authority. This of course can come with conditions on the access, and this also, of course, the consents, the resource consents, have conditions attached to them, which are designed, of course, in large part to protect from environmental damage. Really the thing I'm most concerned about with this report, and it's actually my first recommendation, is to do with these 2 parts of the process. At the moment, as I said earlier, the permit for the minerals granted by the Minister of Energy and Resources, the permit for access onto the land by the Minister of Conservation. Now, the government is proposing to change that clear separation of roles that we've had for the last 20 years. Now, and the proposal actually is that this access no longer be solely granted by the Minister of Conservation, but also by the Minister of Energy and Resources, jointly together. And I think this is really constitutionally wrong, because the 2 ministers have very separate roles. This minister is guardian of the conservation estate. She should be the one who grants the access. This change would take us back somewhat towards the situation 20 years ago before we even had the Crown Minerals Act. And I'm very concerned about that, and my first recommendation is that change to joint decision making should not happen. The joint decision making issue is the subject of my first recommendation. There are 6 others. Most of them are focused on this issue of access and the processes around that, with some suggestions for improvement, recommendations for improvement. One of them, for instance, is around the public being able to get information about the mining on the conservation land, because I think it's very important to be transparent here, because after all, we as the public do own the conservation estate. At the moment, if you want information about any mining on conservation land, you actually have to make an official information request to the Department of Conservation, and I think there should be information accessible on the website. Right at the end, I return to the issue of Schedule 4, so I'm going to erase this and go back to my first diagram of the circle. See if I can draw it the same. I think it's got a bit bigger in the meantime. So here we have the 40% of the land that is in Schedule 4. And this, of course, is not in Schedule 4. There are a lot of the land within the conservation estate is put into certain categories by DOC. There is one category called ecological areas that were deliberately chosen and classified some years ago because they filled in gaps, if you like, in terms of representative ecosystems. And those, with the exception of one, I think, are sitting out in here. And I think that is not the way it should be, because in fact some of these, if they're filling in gaps that where particular ecosystems are rare, examples of them are rare, are possibly more value than some of the conservation values in some of the land inside Schedule 4. And so I'm suggesting that the 55 of these that are left out here be added here, unless there's a good reason not to do so. In some cases, it may be that some of them have been degraded, so they're not appropriate anymore. But that is the last recommendation of the report.